Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of AVERE, I'm very pleased to introduce you to today's event. We have triggered during this last semester four STEAM events. The last ones still have to come, of course, around different topics, which are, of course, highly involving the e-mobility sector. So I'm very pleased that we have today our STEAM event focus on the lithium aspect, how we are getting the batteries towards 2035 secured. And Vittoria has done an excellent job to secure this panel today and bring the right people on stage. So welcome, and let's start.
Welcome, everyone. So I'm Vittoria Montanaro, Project Officer at AVERE, and I'll moderate this panel event today. Today's discussion is a hot topic stirring up all relevant partners across the transport segment and beyond. So the future of critical raw materials supply, let's say, is at the crossroad between its supply chain and environmental concerns being otherwise relevant for a boost of the European common market and relevant industries. So critical raw materials such as copper, nickel, lithium, they are food for the digital decade and essential components for scaling up climate savings technologies as most important enablers for the electric revolution to happen. So to this regard, the European Union is taking action to build an action plan and subsequent strategies. So this thus brings a reflection on domestic mining, production, refining, recycling capacity of EU industries, alongside with the need for new regulation on the extraction methods, safeguarding transparency, higher sustainability standards, worker rights, while also securing supply of resources which are notably lacking on our domestic ground. So, in particular, lithium, paramount component for the Lithium-Ion battery production, in turn crucial for the electric vehicles production, seems to have multiple advantages. Just to quote some, fast charger, having a lighter package and lasting longer. So all those benefits seems to have appointed lithium as the new oil. And that is lifting our global race. So on one hand, we have third countries gaining a monopoly on rare earths and permanent magnets by raising prices from 50 to 90% just on the past year. And on the other hand, we have EU-like-minded partners, which are all putting on the ground initiatives and strategies to lessen their dependencies on the critical raw materials supply. So, given that scenario, what's at stake for the European Union? And most important, what's at stake for electric vehicles producers? Just to introduce some points, so a greater autonomy of supply, more diversification on the supply chain, higher sustainability standards, a boost for the European internal market to reskill its workforce and ability, and most important, I think, a momentum for innovation, for zero waste battery productions, and so on. So in the broader picture, lithium seems to be the chance for EU to play a more active role as a frontrunner in terms of strategic compass, political assertiveness, and climate neutrality. So those and more topics will be discussed today. And I would like to welcome, to present Mr. Aurel Ciorbanu-Dordea. We join us from the European Commission, DG Environment, Directorate for Circular Economy. Thank you.
And then I will join the other colleagues. Good afternoon, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I am the Director in charge of Circular Economy in DG Environment of the European Commission, and of course the topic of critical raw materials and the topic of batteries is one of the highest up on the agenda for several reasons. And as Vittoria has indicated, indeed, we are at the crossroads between climate and environmental concerns, which have pushed the European Union, the member states, the economic operators more towards electromobility and the reduction of NOxes for the citizens, the reduced reliance, lesser reliance on fossil fuels. But there are also, and this is where the crossroads happens, we have noticed also in the wake of the COVID crisis a growing weaponization, as Mark Galeotti has put it, weaponization of the use of certain critical resources by third country partners of the European Union and of the economic operators which are active in Europe. And I would say at the crossroads between climate and environmental concerns and the growing weaponization of the use of strategic resources is the concept of strategic autonomy. And this is what we need to address from multiple angles today. I would say there are two further angles in this respect. First of all, of course, you are aware that the President of the European Commission has in the State of the Union, which usually is delivered by her or him in the past, in front of the European Parliament in September each year. She has announced in September this year, among other initiatives for 2023, more for the spring of the year, a strong initiative on critical raw materials, a critical raw material act. And I will comment a little bit with the necessary degree of discretion on a number of elements which we take into account when working on this critical raw material act. The other strand of discussion is related to something which probably you are very familiar with, because it is a legislative proposal which has already been tabled by the Commission some time ago, and which is nearing adoption by the co-legislators of the European Union, by the Parliament and by the Council. And this is the proposal for batteries, a legislative proposal for regulation on batteries. Let me comment a little bit on each of these two strands of activity, and I will start, of course, with the Critical Raw Material Act. I mentioned a little bit earlier with a necessary degree of discretion, because, of course, we are, in a way, maybe not so much at the beginning of the work on this topic, given the short span of time that we have been allocated because of political pressures for to come up with an initiative in this area. After 2 months, you can say you are no longer at the beginning, you are in the middle of the, in full swing, in the middle of the work on this. But we are still in the early stages, and of course we need to be discreet, because nothing is decided until the college, the political body of the Commission, decides, and there will be quite a number of issues on which things may change until the very last moment because of the sensitive nature of some implications. But I can say, first of all, that maybe you will say it's a bureaucratic detail, maybe, but it has its relevance. I would first of all say that our colleagues in the Commission's department in charge of single market entrepreneurship are in the lead, together with the colleagues from DG Trade, from the department in charge of international trade. We are closely associated, we, DG Environment in particular. This speaks volumes about what are the main strand of action or the main pillars of this Critical Raw Material Act, and one can say you have three big pillars. You have, of course, the issue of getting more critical raw materials through mining. And of course, one of the major points of discussions would be how mining operations occur in Europe, how mining is still possible given the high level of environmental protection and also the public concern in this area across European Union. And here our commitment is to come up with solutions that strike a fair balance between the need to accelerate permitting and the effective running of mining operations where it will be necessary, and the continued need for environmental protection. And we are perfectly aware that a large number of citizens, of people living across European Union are very concerned about what is going on next to their door, what is going on with their environment, how they are impacted by different projects. So I think that we can reflect about solutions for accelerating administrative procedures and permitting, but maybe think less about bypassing some important validation steps, and certainly not the important step of public consultations, consulting the public, because actually consulting the public before a project is permitted, is validated by a public authority, is very important in order to have the community together with you, and that the public understands properly what is going on, what are the implications, why certain things are done. The public also invests. It's not only the economic operator. The public also invests in confidence, but also money, buys, sells, etc., etc. So we need to be mindful of this dimension. A second pillar, which is very important, one, and I think it is indispensable, is the circularity pillar and the recycling. And how do we do the most out of the existing resources that we have within the European Union on the market, already in the existing batteries, in the existing electronic equipment, in the existing applications which use critical raw materials. We cannot ignore this dimension. We cannot just rely, because there is a relative scarcity of critical raw materials in actually in the European Union, in the ground, as a natural resource. We see that third country partners offer limited access to their resources or weaponize the access to their resources. So we need to ask ourselves and also to offer economically viable and technologically viable solutions for the recycling and reuse of minerals which are already incorporated in a number of applications currently on the European market. And here Of course, in general, like for the first pillar, one can think about a number of soft measures, effet d'annonce, plan, action plan, etc., measures, but also there will be probably a number of regulatory interventions and, in a way, tightening certain obligations, the multiplication of certain targets, the introduction of new targets, and waste collection streams for instance, waste electric and electronic equipment which is currently not covered by the legislation of the European Union, such as, but I don't know, I mean, one can think, I'm not saying that this will necessarily be covered, but one can think about wind farms, which are currently not covered by this, and incorporate some considerable amounts of critical raw materials. And there are other equipments as well. But we need to strike here, as I said a little bit earlier, the fair balance between desirability and need on one hand, and on the other hand, economic and technological feasibility. And we can understand and we need to think with a time perspective in our mind to balance between urgency and what can economic operators and public authorities put in place in the short run exactly, because it is one thing to recycle an iPhone and another thing is to recycle the how do you call not a wind farm, but you understand.
Blades?
Sorry?
Blades?
The blades and the engine of windmill, a windmill. And the third pillar is, of course, represented by maybe a strategic rethinking of a number of international partnerships that we have with a number of third countries. Friend shoring, as some people, notably in the United States, are putting it. So whom are better partners than those who weaponize the access to their production of critical raw materials, with which jurisdictions we can conclude privileged partnerships, and you have seen even in practice political action from the President of the Commission or from some members of the Commission already taking place in Central Asia, in Africa, Middle East, and so on, and more is going to come in the following period. So these are a number of elements that we are pondering over when preparing this critical raw material act, which can be understood as a big, carcass under which several engines will be hidden, or will be put at work, not will be hidden. So soft law interventions, but also hard law interventions in it. And as I mentioned again at the beginning of my intervention, this must be combined with the entry into application and the preparation for implementation, vigorous, if I can say so, of the, we hope, newly adopted by that time, by the date of the adoption of the Critical Raw Material Act, we can say that the legislative proposal for a regulation on batteries would have completed its legislative, traveling, and will become regulation, fully fledged regulation, which enters into force. Which, of course, it's an instrument which does not display its full strengths from the very beginning, because it has obligations which enter into application at later stages, even in 2030. so builds progressively strengths and builds progressively markets, but we have a lot of work to do on this. And if we will be able to deliver, there might be other, under the carcass of the Critical Raw Material Act, but you note also my caveat and the fact that I am speaking in the last place about this. We ambition maybe to come with complementary initiatives which will be materialization of the Critical Raw Material Act in specific areas. And one can think about the regulatory intervention which takes a life cycle approach, and I will explain immediately what does this mean, in respect of vehicles. So for instance, and some of you might have noticed this commitment in the European Green Deal communication, in the Circular Economy Action Plan 2.0, which was adopted in 2021, where we have indicated that we would consider, the Commission could consider a proposal which would merge into a regulation two directives existing. One, the type approval directive, and which concerns the placing on the market of vehicles, and on the other hand, the end-of-life vehicles directive, which concerns what do you do in order to dispose of the resources in the vehicle. And we see merits in merging this in a single instrument, both from the perspective of the type of instrument, moving from a directive to a regulation, which works in practice in a different way from a directive. And we see merits in improving the functioning of the rules and combining them so that producers and also consumers, why not, but producers, recyclers, other economic operators have the full picture of the full landscape of the obligations and also opportunities that exist in this area. And we could improve also the functioning and maybe also the certain obligations. We could recycle more from the and draw out more benefits from the materials which are incorporated in vehicles. And think beyond batteries, think about plastics, think about glass, think about metals, think about critical raw materials. So these are a little bit a number of elements that we are taking into consideration. I placed a particular caveat about this last regulatory intervention because it is also a difficult one and we need to get it right. And we are not yet 100% sure about when we will make it happen exactly, but we work hand in hand with our colleagues in, this will be a joint initiative also with our colleagues in DG Grow if it will happen. There are high chances that it happens, but there is still a way to go. And this could be, again, and this is also the narrative that we have discussed with our colleagues, a flagship, an example of materialization in practice in respect of a certain type of product which incorporates a large range of critical raw materials, how the critical raw material approach, European approach to critical raw materials could work in practice. So thanks a lot, and of course I look forward to the comments from the other colleagues and stand ready also to engage with you and to answer your questions.
So thank you a lot, Mr. Ciorbanu-Dordea, for your insightful illustrations about future cluster components of battery regulation and Critical Raw Materials Act. A lot to discuss. And I would like now to give the floor to Cecilia Mattea from Transport&Environment, and she's gonna provide an overlook on how European policy can improve the environmental and social impact on lithium extraction.
Hello, everyone. So for those of you that don't know Transport and Environment, whilst we wait my slides, I got a signal from the back, I'm not sure. Yes, thanks. So Transport and Environment, we are a Brussels-based green campaign group that focuses really, as the name suggests, on transport and decarbonizing transport concretely in a way that is sustainable for our health, environment, and people. I joined Transport and Environment 2.5 years ago, roughly, and I specifically focus on environmental and social due diligence in relation to battery raw materials and wider raw materials needed for the sustainable transition. So that leads me nicely. Thank you. Thanks so much. Yes, so that leads me nicely to my first slide, that I think we can all agree in this room that the European Green Deal is not possible without critical minerals, right? So if we think of lithium, the projections from Bloomberg are that we're going to need 5 times more lithium by 2030. If we think of nickel is 19 times, I think, by 2040, pretty much. So again, it's inevitable, and as the Commission just mentioned, it's not about electric vehicles and batteries, it's about our energy system and much more. So our demand, for digitalization, etc. But how do we get these raw materials, right? So the first step there is that mining has to improve socially and environmentally. And it's no secret that the mining industry has been, left alone by the regulator's eye for decades, and that the mining industry has a legacy issue, right? So what we say here is that there are certain things that the mining industry can do to improve environmentally and socially, and I'll guide you through a couple of these as I go through my presentation. And we're also pleased to see that some mining companies are making an effort in doing some of the things that we have here on this slide. So from water management, monitoring biodiversity, restoring sites. If we look at the environmental aspect, good waste management practices. So it's not so much the case of lithium, which we are discussing today, but there are different ways that mining companies can store and manage their waste. Workers' rights, community relations, as was just mentioned, indigenous peoples, but also how do we check what mining companies are doing and how do we ultimately trust them in order to scale up the efforts. So mining is one piece of the puzzle, which needs to be accelerated. But also recycling is key, recycling and circularity. So how do we get these materials into a circular system and ultimately ensure that they go towards the right things that we need on our market? So here, up to 300 gigawatt hour of battery scrap should be available in Europe alone before, globally before 2030. And I'm sure Umicore can talk more about that later on. What's happening on the market right now is that technology is changing, and this is why we believe that policy should too, step by step. So we see 3 key legislative proposals in relation to this. The first one being the battery regulation, which should hopefully be adopted soon. The second one is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And the third one is the Critical Raw Materials Act. So these 3 things are key parts of the puzzle to ensure that we regulate the mining industry, that we incentivize circularity and recycling, and ultimately contribute to a better, to in this case, more lithium, better raw materials. So if we look at the battery regulation in general, there are, and specifically for lithium, so according to T&E analysis that we've done, the climate impact of battery raw materials can vary greatly depending on the way they are sourced and manufactured. So here we did a study, for instance, on solid-state batteries. And I mentioned solid-state, but we can mention LFP batteries. But again, here the point is that we have a lot to improve on the climate aspect, because as you can see from this graph, roughly, with better sourcing methods and decarbonized supply chains, we could reduce, changing chemistry in this case, we could reduce the carbon footprint by more than 39% just by doing that. And then in the case of lithium specifically, so here we studied lithium carbonate, which it can be used in LFP batteries as an anode. Again, we looked at different ways of sourcing it, so from hard rock to geothermal, and what the climate impact was. So here, regulation that pushes for carbon footprint, lowering the carbon footprint as the battery regulation does, is key. Here, again, an example of different ways of sourcing lithium, from carbon footprint to water use to land. The message is the same. So if we focus on the first line around CO2 emissions, geothermal, yes, it's has a very low carbon footprint because it uses renewable energy. There's underground reservoirs, hard rock mining, different ways. It really matters what we try to push for. And if in the case of hard rock mining, again, depends underground mining, open pit mining, and these are things that policy can push for. If we look at, the title here is funky, I'm not sure why, but if we look at the recycling aspect, so the second pillar of the battery regulation, what we calculated is that with an ambitious policy proposal of 90% lithium recovery targets, as proposed by the Parliament, and again, as it's being negotiated right now in trialogues, we could reduce our demand from primary lithium up to 30%, up to a third. So again, what we want to stress here as Transport and Environment is that we cannot get that community consent, we cannot get people on board on these things if we don't strive enough for better circularity, for better circular policies. But moving on to the big aspect of due diligence and social rights and human rights, here is where we see the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or the CS3D law, which is currently being discussed in Parliament and in Council, and the battery regulation should really do. So the first thing is to cover all types of human rights violation, which right now both do. Through the United Nations Guiding Principles and the OECD for multinational guidelines. They do now, I mentioned, because the battery regulation originally didn't, but both the Parliament and the Council managed to improve the text. The second one, which is key, that both include references or make efforts towards free, prior and informed consent, as well as the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. As we think of where these raw materials are located globally, in Europe or abroad, it's crucial that we get communities on board, and we cannot do that without consent, informed consent from communities. And what we advocate for as T&E is that the consent from communities must be, or their relationship must be built before, during, and after. So before, it means, as the Commission was saying, can I build a mine here, etc. During, it means it's been proven in studies that communities can be a first mover in identifying environmental due diligence issues, for example, because they know how their water taste is or what it looks like. So are you engaging your communities in your processes? For example, Savannah, which is a company operating or that wishes to operate in Portugal, they have developed an app through which the local community can flag immediately if they see an issue, can report an issue, and that goes directly to management. So again, there are practices there that can be copied, that can be improved. And then so a few weeks ago, I was in Spain visiting a copper mine, and I was appalled by the state of how that copper mine had been left. The company, what they've done with it is create a tourist attraction, a site, where I could nicely visit an abandoned mine site, pretty much, instead of investing and speaking to the local community as to what did they want that site to be. Why isn't a proper biodiversity plan put in place, and so on. Again, this is just an example of things that could be done, and that I've gone a bit off track from due diligence, but it's the sort of examples really that we hope to see. We want to see clear environmental risk categories, which the battery regulation has, but the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive does not have. And if we want the CSDD to be the base of our international trade aspect of of how we source these raw materials better globally, then it needs to be improved. And then finally, access to justice. Again, there is no trust if justice cannot be accessed ultimately. So for us, the key message is at the bottom of the slide that metals and materials that cannot guarantee transparent social and environmental due diligence shouldn't be allowed on the EU market. And then one final word on the scope of these two laws. So the battery regulation right now, co-legislators are exploring the option of excluding small medium enterprises from the due diligence obligations, and the corporate sustainability due diligence law excludes them full stop. So whilst we understand the current economic environment and the need to support small medium enterprises, we think it's unacceptable that 20% of companies in the extractive business would be excluded from this law, from the bigger horizontal due diligence law. 20%, it's a massive amount of companies. If we're thinking of all the companies that are popping up globally, looking at extraction, exploration in the Amazon or in Portugal or in Spain, that's simply not acceptable, and there should be some sort of safeguards to ensure that also smaller companies must respect human rights and the environment. So if I move on to the Critical Raw Materials Act, before I wrap up, I was pleased to see from the Commission wording around strategic projects. And yes, for us, strategic projects should be conditional upon a set of criteria. So fast tracking these projects, it's great, as long as they meet certain things. So around water consumption, for example, so do they meet the EU Water Framework Directive? Or soil and biodiversity, do they respect the EU Habitats Directive? The plans, in order to fast track, should require companies to have a mine rehabilitation plan, as I mentioned earlier, and require for them to use to have a low CO2 impact. Again, it's in the mining industry, probably it's one of the best case scenarios to use renewables, to use electric vehicles, and so on. And also, and this wasn't mentioned by the Commission, around waste. So waste, what we have there is a huge pot of opportunities across Europe. We have a lot of abandoned mine sites, and this ties into the circularity aspect, where perhaps technology 30, 50 years ago didn't allow us to go in and extract certain materials, or certain materials weren't valuable enough to be extracted. So the Critical Raw Materials Act should also mandate member states to map out these sites in order to extract those raw materials. Again, less relevant for lithium perhaps, but very relevant for other types of critical raw materials. And if we look at the global impact aspect, so on top of the CSDD, CS3D, we believe the EU should build partnerships and invest in projects in resource-rich countries, again with those criteria that I mentioned. That the EU funding to new mining and refining projects should be conditional upon the EUROBAT certification, and that is the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative that's been co-designed by civil society and by industry. We would also like to see, I mentioned this earlier, but I'll repeat it, implementation of the UN declarations on indigenous peoples and free, prior, and informed consent. Indigenous peoples are maybe less important here in Europe. We have some in Scandinavia, but are definitely important, and I'm looking at colleagues here from SQM and Albemarle in other locations globally. And then we'd like to see the extension of the battery passport, so developing other track and trace scheme with like-minded countries to expand and really have transparent and open markets. So CO2, very quick word. So we do believe that EU companies have a competitive advantage on CO2, and the Critical Raw Materials Act should really, give them an opportunity to show this. So an example is Boliden, that makes low carbon copper and zinc, or the act should require mining companies to measure and report CO2 per ton of material, again, to give that advantage to companies that are actually investing in the right technologies. So our recommendations basically on how EU policy could improve extraction, and in this case of lithium, is first of all that access to responsibly sourced global supply. So partner with the right resource-rich countries. The public funding should be conditional upon social and environmental criteria, including the IRMA certification and a CO2 reporting. We want to see the development of a sustainable European supply chain, including recycling, and there, again, high criteria on waste, water, and CO2, and scaling up not only recycling capacity in Europe, but also refining. That's really where we see the synergy, as it's similar skills, and to build a refining or a recycling plant takes much less time than building a mine from scratch. And finally, the governance piece to us is important, as we would like to see the setup of an EU authority on critical metals. So I hope I gave you some food for thought with this. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Cecilia, for your clear presentation and for spotting a light on due diligence and the importance it covers, and for sharing best practices as IRMA certification. And to quickly pass to the third speaker, I would like to present you Mr. Roland Chavasse, hope I'm pronouncing it properly, Secretary General at ILiA, the International Association, Lithium Association, and is gonna talk about the growing market of lithium, so EU demand, sustainability factors, and a bit of myths debunking.
Thank you, Vittoria. Thank you to the association for having me here today. Let's just start with a bit of exercise. If you've got an EV, pop your hand in the air. If you have an EV, don't be shy, nice and high. 6, 7, 8.
Does it count the small ones? No.
Oh, no, I mean,
No,
you have to be able to sit in it.
scooters.
Oh, yes, why not? Why not? It's got a lithium battery.
It's a vehicle.
And out of those 7 or 8 people who have, an EV, how many of them is it your only vehicle? 1. Well, thank you. That's very good. We are, as the previous speakers have said, we're at the tipping point in history. Recently, you probably saw there was a small boy in Dominican Republic born. He was the 8 billionth human being alive. We shouldn't get too morbid, though, in a Malthusian way, because the population as a whole might be growing slowly, but the number of births is actually falling. And in due course, it's because everyone's living longer, they're having a better life, they're having electric vehicles, they want to live better, cleaner, nicer lives. There's no doubt that our children and our children's children will have a very different life from the one that we have. So, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you my slides. I'm just going to give you a very quick pep talk on how the lithium industry is and what it is and what we do. So, lithium is an industry which up until last year didn't have a trade association. Up until last year, the lithium industry had no international representative body. So we were created with the support of 7 of the leading lithium producers out of 8. Gentlemen such as Pablo Altamira's from SQM, Eric Norris from Albemarle, and Wang Xiaoshen from Ganfeng. When my business partner and I first approached them and said, hey, we'd like to set up a business association to look after your interest, they said, okay, that's a great idea, we need one, but you've got to put sustainability right at the heart of it. We said, that's very strange, we're a business lobby group, we're a trade association. And they said, no, the lithium industry is, we're at the cusp of this EV revolution. The world is looking at us. You've got to put sustainability, you've got to put ESG, you've got to put responsible minerals, you've got to put circularity right at the core of of what the Lithium Association is and what it does. And so that's what we do. One of our 3 pillars is all about promoting ESG and sustainability. The other 2 are to represent the industry, both as an ambassador, but also as a complaints desk, and also to do education. I mean, even in two or three short speeches, we've seen the diversity of sources of information on lithium out there. Far from me to throw the first stone as I stand in my glass house with my glass podium in front of me. But, for example, the water figure in one of your slides, Cecilia, I believe it was taken from the business case slide deck of a company which is not actually producing lithium yet. And so they've kind of scaled down their water use and scaled up other people's water use. Having said that, of the 7, 8 big producers of lithium today, lithium is produced to among the highest standards of any industrial commodity in the world today. We have 5 of the big producers signed up to IRMA, which is without a doubt the toughest, most rigorous, most invasive, but also the most revealing international standard for production of anything in the world. 2 of them have also signed up to Race to Zero. So in lithium, it's not just talking the talk, it's walking the walk or driving the drive, or however you like to say it. The whole world is talking about lithium. Even my mother talks about lithium. I mean, I dare say your mothers talk about lithium as well. But nonetheless, the word lithium is perhaps one of the least understood words for an element which is commonly in the public's vocabulary. And this is a challenge. Vittoria asked me to talk about some myths. Maybe we can talk about some myths in the Q&A afterwards. I would just like to wrap up by saying that the lithium industry, lithium itself as an element, as an atom, is abundant. It's the 25th or so most abundant element on the Earth. And to be fair, it's probably a lot more abundant than that. Simply, we have not been looking for it hard enough before. Because up until recently, in the last 5 years, there was no need to have 3 million tons of lithium LCE produced by 2030. There was no need to supply all of this battery material for millions and millions of cars, and so it wasn't looked for. If you look at the USGS figures, for example, there are entire nations, entire continents, which are not listed as sources of lithium. And undoubtedly there is lithium there, it's just we haven't looked for it. There are some easy, low-hanging fruit, which I think the EU could go for. One of the bottlenecks is in financing. Financing of, in particular, mining projects, and in particular, the high battery quality production of lithium chemicals. An easy way to encourage that would be to include lithium, and indeed the battery value chain, in the new taxonomy, which is being discussed at the moment. And please, 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 seriously, on my knees, don't be too hasty in reclassifying lithium as a 1A chemical. We don't believe it is. We don't believe that your science demonstrates that it is. I don't believe that you believe that your science demonstrates that it is. But nonetheless, there are millions of people across Europe who see it, they read it, they go, oh my God, the European Union tells me that it's 1A, which is a fairly harsh categorization of toxicity, shall we say, in layman's terms. And you say that you're building a mine next to me? Oh my God. And I mean, Director, you talked about encouraging mining in Europe and battling perceptions of you didn't call it NIMBYism, but we can call it NIMBYism. This kind of lack of clarity on what lithium is, whether it is 1A or not, it doesn't help public's perceptions. It doesn't help in their willingness to have lithium projects, be it mines, be it refineries, be it recycling facilities, or even battery plants. It doesn't help the situation when we have a lack of clarity, which is really based on some very, very thin and dubious scientific information. I'd be happy to share my slides by email afterwards. If you have any questions, I will be up front. Thank you.
Thank you, Roland, for your presentation. It really grabbed attention. And now is the moment for Ian Tytgat, or for pronunciation, Director Government of European Affairs at Umicore, which is the technology company for production and recycling of critical raw materials. Please.
Thank you. Could you please give my slides? Yeah, thank you. So just to introduce the company, Umicore is a materials technology and recycling company. So recycling was already in our genes before it was a buzzword in the political scene. But in the value chain of the batteries, we are partially in refining, so refining nickel, cobalt, then producing the cathode active material. So for us, it's an NMC mixture. And then we sell it to cell manufacturers, that goes to the OEMs, and at the end of life, we recycle the batteries to get back access to the materials. So for us, recycling is really closed-loop recycling, and part of our supply of the materials needed to make new battery materials. So the picture is our first operational plant for CAM production, so cathode active material in Europe. So we started our activities already more than 20 years ago in Korea, then later on in China, and now we are active in Europe. But all the way, the research on fundamental research on new products has been in Europe and Belgium all the time. So I will share a few slides that does not come from me, but in fact it confirms what has been said already before me. So there's pictures from a recent report from the International Energy Agency demonstrating how much more lithium, cobalt, nickel, etc. we will need for the next decades. So for lithium, the prognosis are between 10 and 40 times more, not percent, but times more that we will need for our future battery needs. So for cobalt and nickel, it's slower, and copper even more low, because of course that effect is a bit diluted by the use of cobalt, lithium, nickel, cobalt, nickel in other applications than just batteries. For lithium, batteries are by far the biggest application. So if that grows with a factor of 100, well, okay, then the lithium will follow also with a huge multiplication factor. A very interesting study. I can only recommend to have a look at it. And so some people think that recycling is a big contributor for coping with this challenge. But a picture that has been shown by my colleague of the battery recycling on the Kokkola Materials Week, we expect that the return of used batteries, so to really contribute to the recycling, will only be somewhere in the 2030s. So that means that for the next decade, we will not rely on battery recycling as a source of raw materials. We have to develop, of course. But what's also important, and there's a second message, the blue line represents the share of batteries in the total volume that can be recycled, because a factor that is very often forgotten, that is, we produce a lot of battery material waste during the production. It's not because that production is bad, but because all those new production lines in Europe produce or generate scrap because of qualification processes. So the car industry rightly requests a lot of qualification processes before the material can enter in a car. You don't want that your car would explode. And therefore, all those new battery lines, it's new materials, new lines, new processes. So all those materials have to be qualified, and that generates a lot of waste. So what's important now on the short term, so the next decade, is that we have tools in place to keep the material in Europe. Because what we see happening today is that this material is shipped massively out of Europe and recycled somewhere else. But we have to keep it here. We are asking the Commission to consider ways or tools to keep it here. One way is to classify that material, that intermediates, that it is hazardous waste, so that it's more difficult to export. And another tool that we are pleading for is to include it in the calculations for the recycled content in the future, because that would be an incentive to keep the material in Europe, to use it back into battery materials in Europe. So these are the challenges that we have to do when we recycle the batteries. So our customers request a CAM, so cathode active material, that is we cannot give in quality, and it has to be homogeneous products, always the same quality and reliable produced. Whereas the input in the recycling is a huge variety. It's a variety in battery chemistries. It's a variety in lifetime that it has been done in the world. The applications have been different. There is production scrap, and there are battery material end-of-life batteries. So the huge diversity has somewhere to go through a process and finally end up in a production line for new battery materials that are all qualitatively the same and guaranteed quality. And that's a challenge, and therefore we develop a process. As a company, we have history in a broad ranges of technologies in metallurgy, and broadly speaking, there are two main roads in metallurgy. It's hydroprocesses and it's pyroprocessing. We master both technologies. And so what we have done for our processing for battery and battery scrap is a combination of a pyrometallurgical step with a hydrometallurgical step. And why? Because a pyrometallurgical step is a very efficient, both in terms of footprint, in environmental footprint, and in economic footprint. It's an efficient method to separate the more precious metals from the less precious metals. And so that means that following hydro refining can be done much more efficiently, much low cost and much lower impacts on the environment than if you would do immediately a hydrometallurgical step after shredding the batteries. So the combination of a pyro process with a hydro process gives the lowest footprints and the highest yields for the critical materials. There are a lot of initiatives on battery recycling going on in Europe. So this is a picture. You can find more pictures of that. But the problem we see with the initiatives on recycling is that most of those initiatives stop after shredding the batteries. Then they do a separation of some fractions, then they have an aluminum fraction, they have a copper fraction, and then they have what's called the black mass. And what is happening today with the black mass is that it is not suited for a hydrometallurgical plant of today, and the hydrometallurgical plants for the refining of that black mass do not exist in Europe. They do not exist at all. So either we have to invest in dedicated hydrometallurgical refineries for black mass, or we have to see how we can treat the black mass in such a way that it can fit in existing refineries that already do the copper, nickel refinery. So that's an important bottleneck that we see. So the initiatives of shredding batteries, there are plenty, but refining afterwards, that's a huge shortage, and we risk that all our materials will be shredded, yes, but that they will be exported, and we will come back into the form of batteries or cars, and not in the form of refined materials. Another study that we would like to present in short is the study sponsored by EUROBAT and performed by the University of Leuven. And it's referring to, well, it's a very extensive study on what Europe should do or could do to be resilient and producing enough materials, etc. And there are 5 pillars defined. And Mr. Director has already mentioned several of them. Maybe you have read already the study. So several of these pillars come back in the 3 strategic axis that has been mentioned for the Critical Raw Material Act. So it's mining, and so fulfill or use the potential mining in Europe, but also outside Europe. The refining, as I said in my just a few moments ago, we have really to invest in refining and not just in mining. And then what's called there's a new word I heard, the French sharing or French shoring. friend shoring, so make sure that we have partnerships, reliable partnerships outside Europe, and recycling then of course as well. But a pillar that is also important and that we should stress, that is what I call number 5 there. I would call it doing more with less. And just to give a few examples of doing more with less, it can be on product level. If we look to the battery chemistry that we have had 20 years ago, that was called LCO, lithium cobalt oxide. Today we have NMC. That means that already 80% of the cobalt has been substituted by something else. So we are now NMC 811, meaning 8 parts of nickel, 1 part of cobalt, 1 part of manganese. So that means that the 100% cobalt is today 10% cobalt. So we did already a huge effort to get that cobalt content lower. We believe there is no need to get it more lower because cobalt is a byproduct from the nickel and the copper industry. And if you need anyway a nickel and copper to have a battery, then you have the cobalt anyway. So going further lower is not really essential. But another example of doing more with less is, on technical terms, I could give you the example of the use of silicon to substitute part of the graphite. We have developed a product that we can reduce 50% of the graphite in a battery by adding 5% of silicon with the same or even better performance, so making less need for the critical raw material of graphite, having a smaller battery for the same performance, and based on an additive on silicon. But an important other element is also societal. If you know that the car is used 5% of the time, so 95% of the time the car is idle, that's 2,000 kilograms of material that's at the curbside. Suppose what would be the effect of the need of all those raw materials if we could go to 10% use phase of usage. And so then we could do the same mobility with 50% of the materials. Isn't that something that we have to try to achieve? Please, the slides are back, okay. So that's what we have to do, I think. There was also something about mining and lithium. I wanted to share those 2 pictures. The one is illustrating where in Europe we find lithium. So you see, as Richard, I believe, has said, there is a lot of lithium, and even in Europe there is a lot of lithium, and we have to explore the possibilities to extract it. And there are several European initiatives. On the right side of the picture, you see some of the initiatives that are happening. But also there, we need to do it now and quick, because also for the closed loop of lithium, we will need refineries in Europe. So if we don't have a European lithium refinery, what will happen is that the lithium that we concentrate in a fraction of the recycling, that it will be exported somewhere else. So we need to develop European refineries also for lithium. So that's a bit my conclusion. You can read it again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing those insightful guidelines about EU domestic capacity in recycling. And now, last but not least, Mr. Rene Schroeder from EUROBAT, leading European Association for Battery Manufacturers, is going to present about battery policy framework and opportunities and challenges for the battery manufacturers. Please.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for having invited us to speak here at this event. Now, as we all know, decarbonization is the top priority of our times and of our society, and batteries certainly play a key role when it comes to decarbonization. Now, as we all heard this for the past hour or so, one of the bottlenecks when it comes to battery manufacturing is the raw material supply. Just to give a figure to show the dimension that we're talking about, the global lithium-ion battery market is projected to grow from $4.6 billion in 21 to $22.8 billion by 2030. So roughly 5 times bigger, which obviously also has impacts on the raw materials supply and the raw materials question. Again, we already heard this afternoon that raw materials are critical for the battery industry, and recycling, and I think that also came across, is part of the answer, but not the full answer. But we will have to talk about the whole recycling, or take the raw materials question from a broader perspective, which obviously also involves mining. Again, just to give a few figures, the critical mineral mines needed to meet global battery demand by 2035. So globally, it will mean 78 lithium mines, 62 additional cobalt mines, 72 nickel mines, 108 natural graphite mines, 54 synthetic graphite mines. So it shows the dimension that we're facing globally, and obviously this makes the question and the policy discussion around critical raw materials very relevant right now. We've also already talked this afternoon about the batteries regulation, and how the batteries regulation is regulating batteries and also addressing the part of the answer as far as it concerns raw materials. The batteries regulation, with the measures on recycling that we already talked about, and many other measures such as carbon footprint, chemicals management, due diligence, battery passport, is watched globally. So it's a major milestone that we're taking. It's being watched globally, and it will set the level playing field. So we hear from colleagues, and we are discussing, and we get questions from colleagues in Australia, India, China, Japan, the US, Canada. But the question is, what will be beyond the level playing field? So how can we further distinguish as Europe beyond the level playing field? And I think that's a question we need to answer. And raw materials is one of the challenges and the bottlenecks and supply chains and energy that battery manufacturers are facing today. There is a more recent one with the inflation, the US Inflation Reduction Act in the US, when it comes to incentivizing battery manufacturing in Europe. So raw materials is a point, but many others that we have to address. And the question, of course, is how do we address all these different points in a sensible way to promote battery manufacturing and the development of the battery ecosystem in Europe. So for us, therefore, we also suggest to look again, to take these questions from a broader holistic perspective, and to come back to Europe's ambition. Because as part of the battery action plan 5 years ago, we said that Europe can capture a batteries market of up to 250 billion euros a year. So that was the starting point of these discussions. And I think we also need to come back to this starting point. And to also make Europe a global leader in sustainable battery production and use. So secure access to raw materials was one of the points. But we should also not, and I think that we are looking into right now. Another point was to develop the competitive battery value chain in Europe, and I think that's something we need to check what impacts questions like raw material bottlenecks or investment questions have, to strengthen industrial leadership, to get a highly skilled workforce, and the questions around sustainability. One last point in there was the consistency with other pieces of legislation, and I think that's a key question as well when it comes to the raw materials question. We have the batteries regulation, we have other pieces of the Green Deal, and then I think the classification of lithium salts is one of those questions as well, and one of those points when it comes to consistency. And the question and the point there is we need to check what is our final goal or what's the ultimate objective. And I think some type of prioritization will probably be needed when it comes to having the right policy measures. So, to conclude, raw material supply is essential for the battery industry, and the batteries regulation is the blueprint for sustainable batteries across the globe. The European Critical Raw Materials Act should avoid over-regulating aspects of the battery value chain, which are already addressed by other pieces of legislation. The European Critical Raw Materials Act is also an opportunity, or we should align it with the ambition of the EU Battery Action Plan, and we should articulate the steps Europe can take to further support the batteries rollout as well as the raw material supply. And we should also use the occasion of the Raw Materials Act to address inconsistency with other pieces of legislation, including the proposed classification of lithium salts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schroeder. So this marks the end of the presentation session and opens the joint panel discussion. If you want to follow other panelists, Mr. Ciorbanu-Dordea. So I would like to break the ice by posing you a cutting-edge question, which is, do electric vehicles' batteries and their environmental impact really offset the benefits of electric vehicles? So that's open questions to all of you. Feel free to run away or stay with us.
Okay. To be honest, this is indeed a very fair question, but the question is already at least 5-6 years old. And so before the battery regulation was discussed, we went already to the Commission saying, look, this is indeed a challenge. We have to make sure that the tailpipe emissions are not replaced by emissions in the production chain. So that's a very fair. But we said, okay, we take the challenge, and you write in your battery regulation that there should be a footprint reporting, so it's carbon footprint and even a cap. And so that is finally, it entered in the battery regulation proposal, and we fully support it. And we take the challenge, really.
Maybe someone else wants to contribute?
Yes, thank you. Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, from Transport and Environment's perspective, the jury's out, right? But now the question is, how do we ensure that electric vehicles, batteries in this case, are as sustainable as possible? And that's why carbon footprint is indeed one part of the puzzle, but we need to go beyond that, right? And that's why we're looking at the issues in relation to extraction to really make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes as the fossil fuel industry. So we really must regulate the extractive industry in general. And then that's really where the recycling piece comes in and the circularity of it. Because ultimately for decades we've just been burning oil, but now we're using resources that we can reuse efficiently.
Thank you. Any other comments on that?
Just to echo the point about circularity, you could almost spin the argument that mining these battery raw materials is an investment for the future. They're not, they're not disappearing, they're not being burnt, they're not being destroyed. And I guess you could say, but hang on, I've seen pictures of EVs burning. Yes, well, we've all seen crazy stuff on Facebook, haven't we? We have a whole folder of lies and propaganda put against the EV industry. But I would say that what you've never seen is a ship containing lithium minerals burning offshore, or lithium minerals coating a seabird until it can't breathe and it drowns. Compared with some of the oil spills and stuff,
of course, we need to pay tribute in a way to the question, but it's a very good question. But however, it tends, like all big questions, to push you to oversimplify the reality. I would join the representative of Transport&Environment in saying that indeed the jury is still out, but I think we are getting there. There to a point where the environmental benefits in a global sense, I mean in a general sense, in a comprehensive sense, will outweigh the environmental footprint of EVs. But indeed we need to work in order to make sure that the regulatory, technological, organizational, management conditions are in place in order to draw these benefits. They will come from technology, from attention given to the implementation, execution of projects, compliance issues, and the way in which the supply chains and the recycling is organized. How functional are the secondary raw markets across the European Union and also in other jurisdictions, of course. So and of course we need also clear tools which allow measurement and comparability if we need to respond to such a big question.
Thank you. Yes, pretty clear now is the moment to set the preconditions in advance for the market in order to exploit in the most fair, equitable and sustainable manner. So that's a joint forces. And I would like now to ask to Mr. Jan Tytgat, given to his presentation, so can Europe really cover all its needs for lithium and other key raw materials just by building domestic capacity supply? And I will also slide the same questions to speakers which are interested.
Well, the short answer is no. We will not be self-sufficient for many decades, so that's clear. As I said, we can do some recycling, but that will only bring off after 20 years or so. So we will need for the next 10, 20 years access to raw materials from outside Europe. Of course, we can try to develop some mining activities. So at Lithium, I've shown some projects on the screen, but there are also some other minerals that can be sourced in the Nordics, in Finland. They have access to some nickel and cobalt, but that is far below what we expected to need.
And maybe to add to that, I think the big question, well, raw materials diplomacy, I think we already had that certainly, I would say, since the raw materials initiative, so at least for 15 years, that word is quite known. So what do we need in foreign jurisdictions to secure access to raw materials? And I think politically, we need to have a long-term strategy there. So I don't think once we build the momentum, we cannot and we must not drop that momentum. And I think that will require some type of mapping, some type of strategy for at least 10 or until the end of the 2030s, likely.
And that brings me to the following question, which is how to avoid replacing unwanted dependencies on Russian fossil fuels and Chinese lithium refining capacity in this, to this regard. So who wants to take the floor on that?
You mean how to friendshore, you mean? by friendshoring. So by identifying those international partners which structurally are less likely to weaponize the the access to their critical raw materials. Structurally meaning that they have a forma mentis, values, and broadly speaking system of governance which is compatible, in order not to say that it's similar or it mirrors ours, but it's compatible very much with our own. Or maybe I'm exaggerating here because a little bit, and certainly, I mean, there is more reflection to be done, and actually there are people who reflect and act on these and write books. Sometimes you don't necessarily need democracies which are similar to your system. You have just maybe less democratic jurisdictions which, however, have a certain approach to global affairs and to international relations that makes them very unlikely actors for the weaponization of the access to their resources. I don't want to give here examples, but we have big examples. I mean, where, what is it? You can ask how democratic is a regime in country X. However, for different reasons, that regime, even if not identical in its broad features with what we have in North America or in Europe, is not likely to weaponize this. This is a solution, but it's clear that you need to combine this. I mean, it's a broader game. You need to yourself put in balance when you discuss with friendlier jurisdictions other interests, of course, food security, other types of partnership, other types of support that Europe can lend to them in international fora. And it's clear that the answer to the situation as it stands now, it's not just by shifting, how to say, your suppliers from, I don't know, China to Morocco, or to another, or to Peru. It's, you need really to act on the indigenous front, to say like this, on to the domestic front, by building your own supply chain within the European Union, and exploiting also, again, recycling. So I come back in a way maybe too simplistic or too predictable to the triad which I was exposing in my initial intervention.
Yeah, and staying on the same topic, I would like to ask to Mr. Chavasse, how do we take into account the concerns for indigenous and local communities while we settle down an extraction process inter-countries? Which are the safeguarding methodologies? Where's transparency? And I would like to hear your point on that. Thank you.
An easy one.
Fair play.
So I can only speak really from what I've seen amongst our members, our 7 core members. That's what we call our producer members, core members. As I say, 5 of them are signed up to IRMA. 2 of them are signed up to Race to Zero. They operate in many jurisdictions, but when you generalize about lithium, you're mostly talking about Australia. Over half of the lithium units get mined in Australia, where they've got extremely progressive acknowledgement of the indigenous land rights. In fact, one of our core members, every single email I get, there's a large statement on the bottom acknowledging the ownership of the land by the First Peoples. It's wonderful. It can be slightly frustrating when you're scrolling back through a chain of emails, because it's never press print, of course, because then you're lost. The other 2 really big countries there's a third, which I'll mention as well, is Chile and Argentina. In Argentina, it's a federal system, so the federal states have got a very big say in controlling the resources. In Argentina, the lithium in the ground is actually owned by the state, and the companies who extract it have licenses which they need to renew. And believe me, they have operating under some incredibly progressive regimes of both involvement of the local communities and also a royalty taxation. I forget off the top of my head, but it was a phenomenal increase. It was linked to price. Maybe one of the gentlemen in the room from those companies could share a number of 5 billion for the local communities from
for the state, local communities and the region.
Yeah, I mean
Billion with a B of Barcelona.
billion with a B. I mean the regimes, the royalty regimes, the tax regimes in Chile for lithium companies are very progressive, should we say. They generate a huge amount of value for the country and for the local community. And as far as it's the position of an association or a corporation to get in between state government and local government, which is to say not really, it's encouraged to trickle down all the way down to grass levels. Of course, the challenge is how do we engender that sort of exemplary behaviour throughout the new mining companies coming in? How do we maintain those incredibly high standards and just let it be known that lithium is simply, that's the standard, there's nothing else.
Thank you for your reassuring answer. That was also the chance to debunk maybe some myth around the lithium extraction so far. So I would like now to change a bit topic and talking about more the economical aspect, domestically speaking. So maybe to Mr. Schroeder, if you want to answer on how raw materials extraction, processing, refining could create jobs in Europe, and which skills are needed according to your association.
I can only give you a general answer to that. I think Jan probably could give you a more detailed one then. I think generally labor is a key point, right? And I think finding the right labor and finding labor in general is a question for all of Europe, and it will be become an even more important one over the next years and decades. And I think then putting in place skills program, qualification, training, recruitment, university programs, that of course either is already there in place and needs to be further development as the industry is further developing and as the value chain is further developing. But I think generally finding the right labor today is of course a challenge that needs to be factored in. But I think on the skill set, maybe Jan wants to go a bit more in detail.
When we announced our first investment in battery material production in Europe, we had to go to the Flemish Minister President to explain why it was not in Flanders. Because they said, yeah, we have given you such amount of money for research, and now you will produce, and you will not do it here. So please explain. And so the explanation given by our CEO himself was, we need three key elements that we could not find in Flanders. First was simply square meters. We need a lot of land to build all those plants. And Flanders is already very densely built, so land. Second, and that may amaze you, is access to green energy. Because our policy is that every new plant should be built or should operate with renewable. And we could not find enough projects on green electricity in Belgium and Flanders. And three was indeed access to labor. our plant in Hoboken in Flanders near Antwerp has permanently 100 vacancies for operators. We don't find them. So we will not build another plant where we need 2,000 people. We had to move to a place where we had those three elements together, and finally we have selected a site in Poland. But the profile of the people, I can tell you, as an international company, we have less a problem to acquire or to recruit people with high university degrees than operators. Because for university degree people, we can hire worldwide. And people are happy to join us in our research centers in Belgium, and they come from everywhere. But operators, it's not so easy to motivate them to move from their homes or countries to our plants. So there we see a kind of a competition between the companies, certainly in Belgium, and they just hire people from one company to the other company. But as long as the pool of operators is not growing, we have a shortage on nurses, we have a shortage on teachers, we have a shortage on everything in Belgium. So it's not a company problem, but the profile we need is ranging all levels from operators, maintenance people, researchers, management team. So we need the broad range, we need everyone.
A total reskilling and upskilling of workforce as well.
We need all means to get people.
Great. I would like to give also the floor to the audience if there's some question you would like to, please.
Thank you for your presentation. One very targeted question here for Rene Schroeder. You mentioned a bit the Inflation Reduction Act. Are you satisfied with the current drafted solution that the EU is thinking of, the European Sovereignty Act, and basically mirroring US action? And then a more general situational question. Very tough, I know, but if China was invading Taiwan right now and we had a similar situation than we have now with Russia, and we politically cannot just continue to get raw materials from them, how bad would the situation become? Thank you.
Maybe to start on the Inflation Reduction Act, so it's something we are looking into right now, what it means in terms of consequence. But I think one measure is that we need to also look what does industry need now holistically and broadly. And I think it should go beyond, or likely to go beyond, investments. What we hear already before the announcement of the Inflation Reduction Act, I think what industry needs now is also clarity, planability, coherence, and I think relatively quickly. Because of course, it's a whole group of issues we're facing right now with raw materials, energy, supply chain, now Inflation Reduction Act. So I think it's many challenges within a short time and even overlapping.
If I can add a few words on the IRA. Some people believe that investors can shift their focus, that they say, okay, instead of investing now in Europe, we will take the same money and we will put it in the US because we have a better return. I don't see that happening for the most crucial parts of the battery value chain. I mean, in our case, for instance, we will continue to invest in Europe, and we will also invest in the US or North America because the market is there. And not because of an occasional subsidies or tax reduction, whatever. I'm not generalizing in the sense that maybe this is right for us. Maybe for others, they have other decision making. And I think, for instance, at companies producing essential, but in volume, smaller amounts of materials that can easily be shipped. Just for instance, electrolyte or separators or whatever, they are essential. But maybe those companies could maybe say, okay, well, it's more attractive because the critical mass for them, I don't know, I'm not familiar with them, but if the critical mass can only justify one big plant instead of two smaller plants, they might indeed be influenced by this kind of things. But if you need two big plants, then you will build one here and one there.
Do we have another question?
The Chinese question. I think indeed, let's be honest, that there will be a lot of ruptures in supply chains. That's clear. It's obvious, and that's why we need indeed friendshoring. But in our particular case, today, if it would happen today, we would have a problem because a part of our refined materials that we then convert in Europe into battery materials come indeed from China. But we have investment plans to have our European refineries be expanded because we need more. But today it would be indeed a huge issue also for us.
If I may, I wanted to offer an answer to a much more benign but not less important, economically important question, which was, I mean, it's an issue which was raised by you, I think, and by Mr. Schroeder. Apologies. When you made the comment about the coherence, the consistency of different regulatory pieces and the coherence with how lithium salts are qualified under the REACH regulation, and because we are dealing with this right now, it had offered me the following reflection, and we have to discuss with our colleagues. I don't think there is a contradiction. But if I'm still not familiar, I mean, REACH, I have REACH in my portfolio, and it's a nightmare, and it's the most difficult responsibility I have, and I still need to learn a lot. So its qualification as a hazardous substance should not be seen as a capital punishment. It will not be a ban. What we need is to discuss, regulators and the industry, how we present in a fair and transparent way this outcome to the public opinion, to reassure both workers, the industry, consumers, that they don't have a bomb in their car if lithium salts are qualified as reproductive, impacting reproduction or the development of the fetus, because I understand it's about this. We need, and you are the first ones, to be able to say that a number of protective measures are already, you the industry, are already using them. That workers, and maybe some additional ones, need to be taken in handling the products containing these salts, but that this is not, I mean, the technology already offers solutions which protect workers, protect consumers, and that it's not a capital punishment for the industry. This is what we need, instead of bending procedures in order to see how we deflect this and etc. And I know that regulators in different international jurisdictions, in the UK, in other countries, have come to relatively different, I mean, nuanced decisions, maybe milder. Some of you point to the fact that we tend to go in towards a harsher solution, but I think we have a joint interest in demystifying the issue and telling the truth to the consumer. There are solutions to this that will not affect you and that will not cost you significantly, instead of bending procedures, because there are different scenarios which are being discussed. So, but otherwise, of course, we totally subscribe to your call for consistency, and This is not to say that there are not other inconsistencies we need to address, and we will try. And we rely on you also coming to us very straightforwardly, and we will not shy away from talking to you. Come with us, to us with data and with the concrete problems that you have, and we have the interest to address this in an environmentally mindful way, but also in an economically sound and technologically sound way. And we had a big experience. It's not yet over. It was also a very difficult experience. For instance, preparing regulation which is likely to be adopted by the College of the Commission, a proposal for regulation next week on packaging and packaging waste, and moving from a directive to a regulation. Huge change, and the technological and economic problems, and from the strike of a pen, adding or subtracting 5 words, you can wipe out a sector or tilt the balance in a different direction. So we are absolutely aware, and we have appreciated a lot that the industry, there have been some incidents, and an early version of the regulation has been leaked by a media outlet from the Brussels belt, and the industry, of course, got alarmed and came to us telling us, listen, these are, no, there is a problem here, we cannot go in this direction. And yes, we don't pretend that we know everything, and we rely a lot on the feedback that we receive, and we are ready to correct and to improve things, and to also learn things that we cannot know because we don't operate in this sector, and a public authority cannot claim universal knowledge.
Any other question from the audience? Last call? Okay. Please.
It's not a question as much as an observation / statement. The International Lithium Association is, as the name suggests, an international body. And in the interest of full disclosure, we do have 2 out of our 7 core members are Chinese. They are also investors in some of our other core members. Many of our associate members, well, I say many, maybe about 6 out of 40, are also Chinese. The lithium industry is an incredibly complex, in terms of globalization, industry. The Chinese refiners need Australian spodumene to operate, for example. It's terribly interwoven, and there are very few companies who are not cross-border. So
Let's think as a lithium as a tool for peace indeed. Thank you. I would like you to give an applause to all our speakers today. Thank you so much for joining us and raising such important discussion. And I guess now we can all slide to have a glass of beer or wine or whatever you like. Thank you again.